Hello, everyone. Good morning, esteemed guests, colleagues, and partners. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to today's important discussion, co-organized by Africatalyst and the Center for Global Development. I would like to begin by expressing our sincere thanks to CGD team and for their collaboration and continued partnership as we address the pressing development challenge facing Africa and the world. For those who do not know me, my name is Jean-Claude Chachouan. I'm Senior Advisor at Africatalyst. At Africatalyst, we're deeply committed to advancing economic development across Africa, working closely with government, development institutions, and the private sector to foster sustainable growth, financial inclusion, and resilient development strategy. Africa is at the core of the global development agenda. And with 39 countries eligible for International Development Association IDA support, IDA has been a critical partner in addressing a wide range of challenges. These include infrastructure, job creation, human development, climate resilience, private sector, and etc. Over the past few years, Africa's economy has been significantly impacted by global crises such as COVID-19 pandemic, the war in Ukraine, and the tightening of financial conditions. As such, IDA support remains essential, but the question remains, is IDA fully equipped to respond to the crisis of our time? One area that deserves particular attention is the need to reduce Africa's reliance on foreign currency denominated debt. This type of debt exposes many countries to substantial risk, including the volatility of exchange rate, which can exacerbate debt burdens. Promoting local currency financing could help mitigate this risk and offer a more sustainable debt path for countries in our continent. Today's event is structured around critical questions. We are fortunate to have my sister, the Honorable Minister Adelate, Minister of Finance and Development Planning for Lesotho, who will be exchanging with Africatalyst Maggie Mutetsi on the effectiveness of IDA in helping Africa countries. We also have exceptional lineup of speakers and panelists who will share their insight on how IDA can continue to evolve and strengthen its role in supporting Africa countries. The first panel, moderated by Clemens Landers from Central for Global Development, will explore the theme, is IDA equipped for our time of crisis? The discussion will examine IDA's capacity to meet the financial and development needs of Africa in the face of ongoing global challenge. Following that, the second panel, moderated by Karen Mathiesen, also from CDG, is on is IDA new result measurement system fit for purpose. The panelists will discuss how IDA is aligning its goal with broader development outcome and ensuring that the resources are being effectively deployed to generate impact. As co-organizer of this event, Africatalyst is proud to be part of this crucial conversation. We believe that through thoughtful dialogue and collaboration, we can identify ways to further strengthen IDA's role in supporting Africa's long-term growth and development. Thank you all for joining us today. I look forward to an engaging and productive discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Sorry. Thank you, Jean-Claude. Hi, everyone. Good morning, and thanks for making time. I'm just going to jump into the conversation. I don't think we have as much time, and we have a couple of panels after this. But I want to note that this conversation is extremely important for the African continent at a time where we have a financing gap of 250 billion. So I'm not sure if the money for IDA is even enough, but we'll find out how we can work around with what we can get and what needs to be done. My name is Maggie Umotesi with Africatalyst, Strategy Comms and Advocacy. And it's a pleasure to be engaging with the Honorable Minister of Finance from Lesotho, Ms. Adelaide. Thanks for having the time today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, as Jean-Claude mentioned in his remarks opening, he said there are top priorities looking at infrastructure, human capital investment, private sector development, something that has been reiterated by the heads of state last year in April, exchanging with the World Bank. How do you assess the effectiveness and impact of IDA in helping African countries achieve these priorities and meet their development financing needs at a time where, we're looking for critical financing in every corner?
Well, thank you very much, Maggie, and I must thank the Global Development Institution for having me this morning. It's a pleasure to be here and to share my thoughts about IDA as a recipient country. Lesotho has been one country that has been on IDA for quite some time, and we benefit significantly from the resources that we receive from IDA. And I must say, perhaps as a start off, that IDA, the importance of IDA cannot be overemphasized, especially for developing and least developed countries, given the number as well as the magnitude of the population that it supports. As IDA recipients, and talking on behalf of IDA recipients, IDA has been very instrumental in addressing key priorities of the African continent and for the least developed countries. More importantly, the social sectors, or developments in the social sectors. And to that extent, I always see it as one instrument that addresses what I would call the attainment and accessibility to global public goods. That are very important in underpinning global peace, global stability, as well as the livelihoods of many populations. One important or two important aspects when it comes to social sectors is the investments that we get from IDA, or that we are able to make through IDA on healthcare, as well as education that is building on human capital. And we must understand that if I were to talk about Africa alone, the magnitude of the population that is youth and that is a population that is unemployed is huge. And it's important for us to invest in that future generation, for us to be able to later on be able to access the demographic dividend that we get from that population. But more importantly, transforming livelihoods of our people through building infrastructure, critical infrastructure that develops that is able to facilitate developments in investments that are done by the private sector. This bridges an infrastructure gap that is huge and that has been there for a very long time, making it possible for these countries to develop and be able to give essential services to their populations. I will not leave behind the investments in connectivity and bridging the digital divide, which is important for developing countries because this is one instrument and technology in all its spheres and in all its forms is one instrument that is very critical to be developed because it allows these countries to leapfrog and move to a higher level of development. The mitigation of risks, such as climate risks, is important. As much as there is financing for climate, it's not very accessible. So IDA plays a critical role in closing that gap as well. So the important thing, and overall IDA's importance and comprehensiveness and its role in the development of the developing world is very, very, very critical. And we have to make sure that we have targeted approaches to use it. But more importantly, the important thing, I think, for us and for all the donors, not just the recipients, is the impact as well as the sustainability of the work that is being done through IDA funds. So it's very catalytic, it's transformational, it's one pool of resources that is quite huge and very critical to the development of the human population.
I mean, when you talk about risk, it brings me to some of the external shocks we've experienced as the continent. I tend to love to say that when the West catches a cold, we sneeze, or it's the other way around. When the West sneezes, we catch a cold. Either way, but the impact on Africa is usually enormous, from COVID-19 to the war in Ukraine, to anything that happens. I mean, we face it roughly. How effectively has IDA responded to some of these various external shocks? Also considering that we don't know. The question is not if, but it's when the next shock is going to happen.
Well, you're talking about a very important part that IDA has played in the lives of the global population. The developing world is one that is fragile, one that suffers most from the risks that are global and that sometimes do not emanate from these developing countries. But they are recipients and they suffer most from the after effects. A case in point is COVID-19. COVID-19 hit the world. Through IDA, we saw responsiveness that is unprecedented when the World Bank Group, through IDA, was able to avail resources for vaccines as well as other necessities that were required at that time to address that need. I must say also, as I talked about climate risks, but we also talked about the wars, geopolitical tensions. Geopolitical tensions emanate elsewhere, but most of the developing world will be the ones that are hardest hit. Supply chain restrictions and shocks hit us hard, and the most vulnerable of our populations were the most affected through increases in prices and inflationary pressures that build up. As a result of that, we saw countries facing restraints in their fiscus, waning fiscal space, and of course debt levels increasing. And of course, as a result of IDA, that is accessible and much more affordable to these countries. Some countries had the opportunity to resort to that pool of financing to alleviate some of the pressures that they felt at that time. So it's a multiplicity of challenges that excuse me, that these countries face from time to time. Climate shocks are much more prevalent right now, and most of the countries are going through one shock after the other as a result of climate shocks. My own country, we're experiencing storms, floods, we're experiencing droughts and heavy rains, and all manner of things. So we resort to either to rebuild, to reconstruct, to respond to the needs of our populations. Sometimes because of these floods, you have diseases coming up, diseases that are unexpected. Sometimes because of the storms, the houses are taken off, the roofs of the houses are taken off, and people are exposed. And then, of course, as a result of the storms, the bridges are washed away, roads are washed away. So the important thing is that IDA's responsiveness is always at hand for us to tap onto the pool of resources and then be able to rebuild. Needless to say that prevention is always better than cure.
Absolutely.
I have advocated through the World Bank Group to say that even as we respond to these disasters, the important thing is to look into how we can invest in early warning systems so that we avoid disasters before they happen and then be able to spend less. It has been proven that if you respond early and prevent, you spend less than what you would spend as after the disaster. So this has been one, it is one example and a living example that where IDA is instrumental and is key, and you can never really replace it for anything else.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm going to say that I'm going to take one question and then we can open up maybe to take a question. I hope we still have some time. And just to hear your views and see how we can get you to engage with the Honourable Minister as well. But there's been robust and ambitious calls for the IDA 21 replenishment. And if you could share with our audience, you know, why you think this historic replenishment is very critical for the world and particularly Africa. But also, as you're talking about that, for me, what's very important is it's one thing to say that, you know, there is the money, but getting the money out is also something to look at. I think the World Bank president has said it takes about 19 months or something like that, as he was here at CGD some time back. And, you know, you can imagine if you have a health emergency and you need money, and it's going to take 2 years to get the money, so the health emergency is going to become critical. That means the financing as well has to double. So it's more of a complex issue, and maybe it's something you can speak to us in your opinion, you know, what you think about it and what could be done as you address these two questions, and then I'll come to the audience and get a question.
Well, once again, needless to say, IDA is an indispensable instrument.
Yeah.
I remember when Mr. J came into office, one of the things that he talked about is the agility with which we respond. And it is his agenda to see that IDA responds, and the bank is much more responsive and much more agile to address issues of developing countries. But more importantly, that we see the impact. We don't just disburse funds and not see the impact. It must be impactful, it must be sustainable. The interventions should also be sustainable. So what I see is, as much as it's important, there's room for improvement in the way that resources, first of all, are used, and in the way that the instruments are developed, so that they are accessible, much more easily accessible. They're accessible on time, and therefore they can do more. But more importantly is also about the size of the envelope. We are in a phase in time when we are facing unprecedented challenges. I don't think the world has ever faced challenges as of our time. So for that reason, it is highly critical that this resource envelope is augmented, and we're able to raise much more than what we have been raising before. For us to close the gap between the developed world and the developing world. Not only close it, but more importantly, it's about providing decent lives for the human population. Some of the things that IDA does, for example, power generation, clean access to power, access to clean water, and sanitation and wash facilities, these are basic human rights. You really can't say a person has a life if they don't have it. They are essential for economic development. No economy can develop without power. No human beings can survive for a long time without clean water and sanitation. So it has to be much more comprehensive. But more importantly also, I think what we are looking for is that accessibility should be at an affordable cost to the countries that are beneficiaries. And that calls for much more innovation in terms of developing instruments that can be suited for the countries that are recipients of IDA. So I think there's room for improvement. There's a plethora of ideas that can come through to say, how do we improve IDA? How do we make it more agile? How do we make it more responsive? And how do we make sure that we see the impact, we see the results at the end, so that the resources actually go to where they are needed most, and in a way that the countries are not, suffering from the burden of debt unnecessarily. But more importantly, also, I think there are issues of justice in there when we talk about the transitions that we are making in energy, the transitions that are required for us to make the world a better place for all of us. Thank you.
Absolutely. And that's why we're here to find, I'm not sure if it's solutions, but to exchange and see how better, IDA can work for African countries. I don't know if there's a question from the audience that is for the minister that we can take. Nicola, sure.
Hello, Nicola Swan, Swiss Think. Thank you for your remarks. I'm just wondering, a theme that has come up already this week is coordination between different entities, and we can take the example, for example, of IDA versus the African Development Fund, and wondering from your perspective, the extent to which there's potential for efficiencies of a scale that would matter to the impact, just in terms of coordination.
Certainly. As I said, there's ample opportunity to make room and there's ample room for improvements. Just a couple of weeks ago, the UN General Assembly adopted the Pact for the Future, basically saying we all have to be much more inclusive. We have to work together. We have to strive for multilateralism to work. That means coordination. That means bringing in not only sovereigns, but also the private sector into the room, bringing in philanthropists into the room, so that we are able to together work for this part of the population that we're seeing is left behind. And I can tell you, I mean, even in normal life, we know for a fact, it's a fact, that even in your own neighborhood, if you're the only one who's out there and is able to live a better life, and everyone else is not living a better life, you haven't started. You will be forced to have the others come up as well, because you will never be comfortable. So we want to have everybody comfortable to the point where there is global peace, there is global harmony, and everybody feels included, young and old, as well as getting rid of the divides, everything, the polarization that's there in the world, whether it be by gender and all the social ills that are there. I'm a strong advocate for this because I believe, because of the problems that we have in the world right now, issues of unemployment, issues of poverty, they are proponents or propellers of the problems that we are in. And if we are not able to go to the source and address those issues, we will not be able to survive in a meaningful way. So my advocacy is that, yes, there's room for improvements. There's room for us to bring in everyone in the room. The slogan is, leave no one behind. We do not leave anyone behind. We want everybody included and everybody to feel that they are part of the world and the dynamics of the world in a positive way. So I do believe there are ways to make these instruments and the likes of it, PRGT and others, for example, in the IMF, much more accessible, much more agile, much more user-friendly, and much more impactful to the global society. If it's the price we have to pay for global peace and for the global public goods, necessary global public goods to be provided, then there it is. We have to do it.
Do we have any other question from the audience? Okay, as you think through, you've talked about how IDA has worked for certain sectors, and you've mentioned in particular like energy, yes, and private sector. But I think we also have to look at where it has not worked. Yes. And from where you sit, in your opinion, are there types of support that you think IDA is not currently providing that it should actually be able to offer?
Well, that's a difficult one to think about.
The difficult ones, you know, get the solutions.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of within the universe of all the things that we are able to address with IDA, whether there's anything that we are not addressing. And frankly, I can't see any. We're doing social sectors, we are doing justice, we're doing governance issues, basically trying to get our economies a holistic set of reforms for them to work better. The productive sectors, you name them all. So what I think is important for us to see if and again, I want to repeat, multilateralism is very important. I'm sorry I got caught up in there, but the important thing is we need everybody to come to the table, and we need everybody to be positive for the future of the world, for us to be able to survive as a species, if I may put it that way. So perhaps we need to pay much more attention to peace building efforts. There are real risks in there that are visible and seem to be escalating. And if we do not address those issues, all efforts that we are, and all the money that we can spend all the money that we can and pump all the money that we want into the system, but it will be all in vain. So I can't think of one sector that I would say is probably underfunded. Perhaps I could just talk about the environment. We need to work on the environment, environmental sustainability, and climate change. Those are the biggest risks as well that need to be funded. Needless to say that there are resources out there. Countries have made commitments. The likes of the UK, Denmark, the others have made sizable commitments, and we need others to follow as well, and then address the issues in earnest. Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Minister. I'm bringing it back to the audience. I think they are satisfied.
That would be nice.
We are right on time, and
yes.
thank you so much for having time to speak to us today. The conversations on IDA are very critical, especially for African countries. We need the money, we need the financing, and we need to get the projects going. Honourable Minister, thanks for making time, and to the audience,
thank you very much. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
And you check your.
Just take my seat.
You can. Great. Well, thank you, everybody, and thank you for staying for the second panel, which is has the big daunting title "Is IDA equipped for our time of crisis?" I really want to build off of a lot of the themes that the finance minister just articulated. I thought it was a really compelling articulation of what IDA means for a recipient country. And a lot of the attention in a replenishment year on IDA is really rightly focused on IDA's role in development effectiveness. And that's going to be the topic of the next panel. But what I really want to focus on here in a large amount is IDA's really playing an increasingly consequential macroeconomic role in terms of macroeconomic stability in low-income countries. And this is really especially true at a time when global financing conditions are really changing for a lot of the world's poorest countries. And we're really finding ourselves in a new era where financing is just very tight. So if it weren't for IDA, a lot of low-income countries would actually be seeing more external financing exiting their economies than entering. And that's very serious, it's very stark, and it's very new. And so I would say, arguably, IDA is the most important player in the global financial safety net today for low-income countries. The IMF is the financial firefighter, and IDA's a real piece of the global kind of financial safety net and helping maintain positive net flows to low-income countries. But this really raises a lot of questions. It raises a lot of questions about IDA's countercyclical role. It raises a lot of questions about IDA's role in the debt architecture. And frankly, it also raises questions about the sustainability of the IDA model. I mean, can we keep on hitting these big replenishments? And it's especially true in an environment where donors are increasingly becoming parsimonious. So we have a really stellar group of panelists here today, so I'm very excited. Not in right or left, because I can never tell my right or left when I'm up here, but let me just start by introducing Margaret Kulo, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Development Finance and Policy at the U.S. Treasury Department and the IDA Deputy for the United States. We have Dirk Reinerman, who's the Director of the IDA Resource Mobilization and Corporate Finance Division at the World Bank, so Mr. IDA this year. We have Gargi Ghosh, who's the President of Global Policy and Advocacy at the Gates Foundation. And we have Ishak Diwan, who's the Research Director at the Finance for Development Lab. And what I thought, Ishak, is maybe you can kind of kick us off. And you recently wrote a very compelling paper about financing conditions in low-income countries. And maybe you can just kick us off by just reflecting a little bit on how the financing environment looks today, and how it's really changed over since COVID, basically. And just maybe reflect a little bit, on IDA's role in these dynamics. Is it helping or exacerbating some of the global dynamics?
Yeah, thank you, Clémence. So just some broad facts to paint the picture. IDA has surged after 2019, and that's the good news. But money has left the 79 IDA countries to other sources, and that's the bad news. If you like, in terms of the total debt of IDA countries between 2010 and 2022 or so, they've gone from something like 200 billion to over 600 billion. So there was a major increase over time and a very important change in composition. In 2010, IDA was at about a third. It's still about a third when you add the grants, but the rest of the composition has changed tremendously. And there were other MDBs and Paris Club, bilaterals. Those became a little smaller, and there was more borrowing from the markets. About 20 IDA countries borrowed from the Euro markets. And from China as well. And so you have a much more equal kind of split of the debt between these 5 key players. And basically the bad news is that there was basically a wave of lending from the private sector that then collapsed over time. They are getting out. And a smaller wave from China. And this is hitting the IDA country badly. So if I look at overall net transfers, money moving in countries, this is new debt minus debt service. In 2022, for low and lower middle income countries, which is a group a little bit larger than IDA, for the first time in 2022, it was a negative number. Money left these countries. And 2023 is going to be much worse because when we get the numbers, because the market, the Eurobond market, closed completely on IDA countries. So countries could repay but not borrow to roll over these debts. And basically, this was composed of this surge from the MDBs, including IDA, importantly, about $40 billion, and then $50 billion flowing out to commercial banks, as opposed to $50 billion coming in 4 years before. So a difference of $100 billion, major. And something like 10 billion going to China. So basically, the foreign exchange in the macro sense is not sticking in. The projects are taking place in local currency, but the equivalent is not there. And when you look, of course, there are variations country to country. So when I look a bit more carefully, say around the regression, you find for a major distinction between green and red countries. You know that distinction in IDA. So for green countries, every dollar IDA puts in, there is an extra 40 cents that come from other sources in 2022. While for red countries, for every dollar IDA puts in, there's on average 60 cents leaving. So it's a major issue, and we need to think of IDA is helping. Without it, it would be worse, but it is also bailing out other creditors in doing so. And that's a problem. We need to think of ways to reduce that problem.
Margaret, Treasury Undersecretary Jay Shambaugh just made last spring an address around this issue of maintaining positive flows into low-income countries and lower middle-income countries and the roles of the different creditors. And I wanted to ask you, how and this subsequently kind of gave rise to the Nairobi-Washington vision, which was announced last summer. And so I just wanted to ask you to reflect a little bit on how you see IDA's role in this, IDA's role in the debt architecture. Is it currently adequate and appropriate? And how is it helping countries deal with the ongoing debt crisis?
Thanks a lot, Clemence. Thanks for having us all here. A great opportunity together. Also, thanks to CGD for bringing Minister Mahlanyani here. It's excellent always to hear from an IDA recipient country about how they engage with IDA, and I'm going to get to that point in a second specifically. But first, let me answer your question. So, yes, it's true. We have been debt sustainability is one of our top priorities in general, and also in the context of IDA, in the context of IDA replenishment discussions. And we think about IDA in two ways. It plays both a policy role and it plays a financing role. And on the policy front, IDA is looking at debt sustainability. It's also looking at how they support countries in domestic resource mobilization, how they support countries in financial fiscal management, how they support countries in managing flows. And it's a technical assistance. It's a very important role that they play, and they do it increasingly together with the IMF. We've seen a lot better collaboration, I think it's fair to say, on debt issues specifically, but just more generally between the IMF and the World Bank, not just on the policy front, but also on issues like pricing. If there are going to be pricing changes in the context of the IDA replenishment, are there also pricing changes in the context of the PRGT instruments at the IMF? So this policy role, this strong collaboration is really important. They also have a really important financing role. And from a macroeconomic perspective, obviously, it's very important to look at the flows. But IDA isn't just financing flows. IDA is financing fundamental investment that spurs growth. We heard the minister give many examples about investments in infrastructure, investments in water, sanitation. These are fundamental investments, not just in the basic decency of the quality of life every day, but in the fundamental economic engine of future growth. So I think it's rather narrow to think of IDA just as one other way to plug a fiscal gap and have positive net flows. Now, that said, IDA isn't the only provider of grant funds. It's not the only provider of concessional finance. It's the largest. And it also has behind it the full wherewithal of the World Bank. It has the full wherewithal of all the IDA donors. It is a multilateral tool that not just levers finance, but levers policy reform, levers support for the IDA countries. And I think maybe I'll end with, it was very instructive that the minister didn't have a lot of suggestions of other things that IDA can do, because the way IDA approaches its support to countries is from what the country needs. Mm-hmm. And I think that was probably the best response we could have heard from the minister. They're getting what they need from IDA to address the needs that they have, and they're getting it in a way that invests in their future ability to grow their economy, to provide jobs for young people, increasingly joining the job market. And if they don't have jobs there, then you lose this opportunity for future growth.
Yeah, no, I was also very struck by that response of IDA's doing so much we have reached, I mean, the IDA is providing what the government is requesting, and that I think is very encouraging, and I think it's something that is a very positive takeaway. But Gargi, I would ask you, IDA has been taking on an increasingly broad amount of functions over the course of its history, and in recent years it's even been being asked to take on countercyclical, crisis finance, more and more humanitarian. And some will say there's some mission creep. We were just in a conversation earlier, Bretton Woods at 80 this morning, and that was one of the things that some of the panelists were talking, not just about IDA, but some of the other international financial institutions of a little bit of changing roles. So I would ask you, how do you think IDA is taking on too much? How would you feel about that? And then to bring it a little bit back to financing, IDA is providing about $35 billion a year right now. Is that the right amount, or is $35 billion too small for all of the things that IDA's doing and IDA's being asked to do from the governments?
Thanks, Clemence. Thanks for having me. I think it'd be very hard to be in this moment and not meet needs where they are. We are a partner of IDA's, and we aren't a shareholder, we aren't a borrower, but we partner very closely and find IDA really an essential partner. And we're feeling the same pulse. So I was on this stage last week talking about growth, and I think we can all agree that the best way to stop talking about debt is to fire up growth. And so if you think about how IDA would do that, and do that in the most inclusive possible way, our part of that is to really focus on human capital, health, women's labor force participation. But there's a set of things that IDA is thinking about that we rely on. I think the growth of the portfolio operating in fragile and conflict is super notable. I just heard this morning, Dirk, this might be your statistic that I'm now using, that it used to be sort of 14% of the portfolio in FCV. It's now over 40%. That's a real reflection of the operating environment. And to Ishak's point, it suggests that IDA is unique in being able to provide financing. That's not a portfolio that a private sector lender would easily go into. I'll give you another example that we think a lot about, which is as you think about jobs and jobs-led growth, we know that is unlikely to be the same old formula from decades ago that is purely on manufacturing. We're going to need to think about digital and the role of digital in jobs and connection to economies. So I'm thrilled to see the bank sort of doubling down on being able to provide advice and financing to support digital transformation in countries. So I think that all needs to happen. The two caveats or bits of advice I would offer first, and President Banga talks about this, if you do all of that in silos, it becomes too much and too compartmentalized to be efficient. Just to give you an example, we work with IDA on agriculture. Our piece of that is on-farm productivity. How do we help smallholder farmers in particular access inputs, growing techniques, weather advice to be more productive? The bank complements that, thinking about sector-wide transformation. Now, if we thought of adaptation to climate change as a separate cone, we would really easily trip over each other, because the reality is adaptation is actually about agriculture and food security in a large way. It's also about coastal areas and building. So we have to integrate how we think about climate into the way we do ag today. So I think there are places to be efficient about it. And then finally, I completely agree with your nudge, and thank you for the leading question. I think if we're going to have these institutions do more, we have to be realistic about needing more financing. We can get more impact per dollar, but we're also going to need some more dollars. And so I think as the bank is out there now, looking for what, frankly, is quite realistic, a constant, real replenishment. I know that African leaders have actually called for an even more aggressive IDA, $120 billion. That's as the minister said before, that's where we are. That's the reality of the world we live in, and we'll have to be quite creative and aggressive and pushy to make that happen.
Great. Dirk. One of the trade-offs that's really at the heart of the IDA financial model and the IDA hybrid model, and maybe you can explain that a little bit for our audience, but one of the trade-offs is really between volumes and terms. Slightly harder terms generate bigger volumes, and conversely, higher levels of concessionality, slightly less volume. So could you kind of tell us a little bit about how IDA approaches this trade-off? Is it currently getting the balance right? What are borrowing country priorities in terms of this trade-off between volume and terms? Are you contemplating any changes in the context of the current replenishment?
Thanks, Clemence. And let me also start with a big thank you to you and CGD for hosting and for all of the good work that you do and the publications that you put out on aid architecture and the importance of IDA. My boss is Japanese, and he says that IDA in Japanese means love, and we're feeling the love, so thank you very much. My answer to you is going to be we need both concessionality and volume, and let me try and convince you of that. The first point, Ishak basically made the case that in this picture of net negative flows and worsening net negative flows, IDA is actually one of the only institutions that provides net positive flows. We had about $18 billion of net positive flows, IDA alone. That's our disbursements minus principal and interest repayments out there in the landscape. So we're providing incredibly important liquidity. That's notwithstanding Margaret's point that it's not just budget support for no reason, but it is project finance, a lot of that for very concrete results on the ground. But if you look at it from a net positive flow point of view, IDA is playing an incredibly important role. If you just take the common framework countries, since the beginning of the common framework, we've provided about $11.2 billion just in net positive flows to those countries. that are under the common framework. So absolutely critical, and absolutely critical in IDA 21 that we continue that. So that's the concessionality story. At the same time, you're hearing it from the minister on the panel, but we heard it in Nairobi, we heard it from all of our recipients, that volume is also important. We have increasing challenges, not just the traditional development challenges, but exacerbated by climate change. We heard again this morning the adaptation challenge. We're hearing it over and over again. And IDA, as a source of concessional funding, also needs to provide volume. So the trick is to get the balance right between the two. So a little insight into the financial kitchen of IDA is essentially that we have 3 levers to do this. One lever is donor contributions, right? Everything else equal, if we get more from donors, we can do either more concessionality, the same volume, or we can do the same concessionality and volume. The second is, and I should start with that actually, is balance sheet optimization. How are we using the resources efficiently, right? That's up to management to do with our board. It's about risk-taking, et cetera. I won't go into the details, but we're squeezing that lemon as hard as we can. And we've produced in this round already 20 billion that we have in addition in the financial model going forward. So we'll continue to do that. And the third one is terms, financial terms that you can change. You can harden them, and then you get, again, everything else equal to get to higher volumes. But of course, given the debt situation out there, that's not a good idea. And what we're doing, in effect, in IDA 21 at the moment, I'll take one of the scenarios just to illustrate. One of the scenarios is 105 billion. Why 105 billion? Because it's real flat in dollars. 93 billion, IDA 20 is 105 real flat in dollars this year. If we were to achieve that the way we're striking the balance at the moment, we would have about 12 billion more volume. We would have higher level of concessionality. We would actually go up from 57 to 58% grant element, as we call it. And we would have a little bit more differentiation within the IDA countries, where we look at the countries that are absorbing a lot of the grants. We're looking all the way up to the countries that are blend, that are also borrowing from IBRD, and see how we treat those. But as a group, IDA, we keep it concessional. In fact, we move it by 1 percentage point forward. So that's the very difficult balance that we try to strike in the model, that we achieve both of those objectives, the concessionality that we need and the volume that the countries require and deserve.
Margaret, climate has been a really big part of the World Bank evolution agenda. Just wanted to ask you how you're thinking about climate in the IDA context and how that translates. We heard the minister talk a lot about adaptation. We've heard a lot about IDA's crisis response role during climate events. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the U.S. priorities on climate for this IDA replenishment cycle?
Sure. So what drove the beginning of our evolution efforts at the World Bank and across the multilateral development banks more generally is this recognition that increasingly it's global challenges like climate change, like conflict and fragility, like pandemics, that are not only stopping us from making further progress on our fundamental poverty goals, the other sustainable development goals, but also setting us back. You know, COVID-19 saw for the first time a 2-year decrease in global life expectancy, the first time since the 1950s. I mean, these are the kinds of shocks that mean if you don't address them, you can't make, not only can you not make progress, but you can't even stay where you have been. The minister gave lots of examples of the kinds of shocks that they've faced in Lesotho. If you think about agriculture sector, I mean, agriculture is climate, and knowing whether you're going to get the amount of water you need at the time you need it in the place you need it is not as reliable as it once was. You can't then grow from an agricultural base in the same way you would have done 40 or 50 years ago. So these kinds of global challenges are really a fundamental piece now of making progress at all in development. So that really was what drove the evolution efforts altogether. We would say IDA was actually a little bit ahead. IDA has a lot of experience helping countries manage through shocks like climate shocks. They have instruments, they have They have a proclivity to be responsive, and they've been increasingly, both in IDA and across the bank more generally, using the tools that they have available to be more responsive, not just the climate resilient debt clauses, which they have been using more frequently, but the overall crisis response toolkit. If you think about that toolkit was just really launched a year ago, July, and you've already got pickup by more than a dozen countries. You've got at least one country that has triggered one of those clauses already.
Do you want to just tell our audience what a climate resilient debt clause is?
So climate resilient debt clause, in the case, let me use the case of St. Vincent and Grenadines, when they were hit by the most recent hurricane, they were able to do a pause on their payments back to the bank for 2 years. That's cash they could use to respond to the immediate needs in the hurricane. So having those kinds of tools available can be helpful. There are other tools, obviously, sometimes it's, the countries need even more cash up front. There are other tools you need, but it's about expanding the opportunity to respond. I want to also talk a little bit about fragility, conflict, and violence, to a point that Gargi raised, because it's not just about, like in climate, it's not just about having the funds available to respond, it's not just about having the tools available to respond, but how the bank interacts, how they engage now, knowing that 40% of IDA countries are facing situations of fragility, conflict, and violence, either immediately within their borders, next to their borders, across their supply chain. How they engage is almost as important as what the resources they have available to do that engagement. How you think about moving in and out of third-party implementation, how you think about those really critical pieces of advice to the countries on prevention, on prediction of fragility, conflict, and violence events. So I think we have to think more. The money's important, absolutely. The size of the replenishment is important, absolutely. But the tools that the bank uses and how they engage is far more important today than it was 3 replenishments ago. You started with climate. All of the countries are talking about adaptation. That's not, a line item finance climate adaptation. Your infrastructure has to be adapted to climate. Your agricultural investments have to be climate adaptive. It's a different way of thinking about all of your investments across the board.
Dirk, I'm going to go back to you. Every 3 years, IDA makes this Herculean effort. Go to donors, negotiate a new policy package, a lot of the things that Margaret was just alluding to. At the end of the cycle, you have donors pledge. Is this model the best way of setting the policy agenda, fundraising? We're in an incredibly crowded field. I feel like every day there's a new institution that's created. Is IDA's replenishment model ripe for a rethink? Can we keep going like this for until IDA's worked itself out of a job?
I'm going to keep going until December. That's my current focus. But let me answer it maybe a little bit more thoughtfully. I think the point I want to make is we're open for suggestions at all times, and we're thinking about it day in, day out, and trying to make some adjustments as we go. Right? I think the first point to make on the value proposition that we don't want to change is the fact that it has this country-based model that we heard the minister speak very eloquently about this morning. That it has the financial efficiency to get to impact, right? It is still the only AAA-rated vehicle out there for low-income countries. And it is incredibly important for the net flows, et cetera, everything that we've talked about. So I think that piece we definitely want to change. I don't want to change, and Ajay keeps saying it's the best deal in development. So we strongly believe that. At the same time, we realize that there is, Clémence, I think you called it a traffic jam of replenishments out there, a traffic jam in fundraising. I think that's right. We feel that. And we need to deal with that. And I don't think that's going to get better going forward. There are a few changes that we're making already now. We're providing donors with some new ways to contribute, right? The model in the past has basically been on grant contributions plus concessional partner loans, right? So partners can give us a loan at concessional rates that's cheaper than the funding cost that we have in capital markets, that little delta helps us a bit on the margin. Hasn't really made a huge difference, but it's an option. Now we also have hybrid capital, which we've already tried on the IBRD side. Now we're also introducing that on the IDA side. And we're setting up a portfolio guarantee platform, which might be interesting for donors that are at the moment, because of their fiscal considerations, are cash strapped, but wouldn't mind providing a guarantee, which we can then use on our side to become financially more efficient. So that's already in some ways a change to the replenishment model, because it's not as singularly cash focused. We're also thinking about, not quite yet in this round, we're thinking about non-sovereign donors as well in a systematic way. We haven't really been able to tackle this. There are, of course, governance questions on how we do this. But we see that more and more we have a lot of wealth out in the private sector with high net worth individuals, with foundations. And we do have interest of some of the foundations telling us, what would this model look like? What could this model look like? So I think there's more an IDA 22 issue. But as we evolve the model, I think this would be a very good thing. But to your point on the aid architecture and how it fits in, we do have a structural problem, right? And you've done good work on this. The current global aid architecture really is an issue. Right? We see, and we've done a lot of work on this, we see a lot of evidence of fragmentation, circumvention. What we mean by circumvention is that at this point, only 40% of resources actually flows through governments like Lesotho to be able to drive their own development agenda. Only 40%. This is down from the time when we had the Paris agenda and we said we would put all of our weight behind governments with good strategies. At that time, I believe, by memory, it was 60%. So we're going backwards. A government like Ethiopia is now dealing with 260 development partners. Right? So we have a real constraint, and this is a government that has relatively okay capacity, but there are many others out there that don't. Right? So we've made it very, very difficult. Kevin Watkins the other day wrote that if you wanted to create a system to fail, you'd design it like this. Right? It is, we have a real issue. And in some ways, IDA is the antidote to that problem, because you have that integrated model, you have that country-based model, multi-sectorally. In some ways, somebody called it the canvas that then others can paint on afterwards. I think it was actually Bill Gates who said that, Gargi. So that we see that it is part of the solution. So I would say, and within that, of course, we need partnerships, because the question earlier from the audience on the African Development Bank, we have a 300 million electricity target for Africa. We're not going to achieve that without our friends in the African Development Bank, and we're going to do it together. We're working closely with the Global Fund on HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria, right? Because again, without health systems reform, that's not going to be a sustainable investments into malaria bed nets and injections, et cetera, unless there's sustainable health sector reform. That speaks in favor of a collaboration between IDA and the Global Fund, and that's exactly what we're doing. So make that more effective. So my short answer to your question, whether we need a rethink for IDA, yes, in part, but I think the ODA model needs a rethink, and maybe Civil next year is a good opportunity to bring that topic back onto the agenda.
Thank you, and that tees up my question for you, Gargi, very, very nicely. So yes, there is indeed this traffic jam. My colleague Janine Keller and I estimated that over the next 2024, 2025, about 12 funds are coming forward for $100 billion. So it's not just the concessional development funds like IDA, the African Fund, it's also the health funds, the climate funds. Against this backdrop, I alluded to it earlier, there seems to be this proliferation of new institutions at a very fast pace. And my question for you is, what advice would you have? I mean, you talked about reforms of ODA. What advice would you have for donors? How best can they go about their decision making when it comes to the allocation of their own ODA and their own resources across these different institutions? What's kind of an intellectual framework or roadmap with which you think that donors should think about these different trade-offs?
Thanks. I do have your chart from that paper up on my wall as a reminder of what's happening. Yeah, you know, I understand there's been some work done counting these agencies, and it's sort of upward of 600 now. So clearly we're in a moment where, as a funder, I hope all donors and, in fact, countries themselves will be looking at the efficiency and effectiveness of those. And there are lots of measures out there. CGD has one, quota. The FCDO has done multilateral aid spending reviews on a regular basis. So I think we have an evidence base to show which of those funds actually rises to the top on effectiveness. And we'll need to do some serious reflection about the ones that don't. I would not confuse a budget crisis among advanced industrial funders with a requirement to feel we don't have effective ways of delivering development. I actually think it's the opposite. I think when you look at IDA, when you look at Gavi, the Global Fund, again and again, those rise to the top of all of those effectiveness measures. And we should be very proud that we do know how to deliver, translate resources into development progress in partnership with countries. You know, if I think about the health sector, we rely, that triumvirate is a very important partnership. We rely on the incredible resources of IDA to help bolster country health systems. IDA sits on top of country spending, which even for low-income countries is the largest source of funding for health systems. So let's not forget that in our focus on ODA. But then, you know, Gavi and the Global Fund sit on top of those systems, or that canvas, I guess, if my boss used that phrase, to really deliver acceleration on specific areas. So I worked on Gavi in its very beginning. And at that time, we used to talk about a 17-year gap between when my children in this country would receive vaccines and when they would actually reach an equivalent family or a child in a low-income country. And today, you know, if you look at HPV, one dose, that has been actually delivered first in many developing countries. So we've really not just gotten resources out, to Margaret's point, but reshaped the market, changed the pipeline of R&D, built a public-private partnership that will kind of accelerate progress in vaccination, raise the ambition of EPI programs, which used to be the kind of neglected child in health systems. So I think the differentiation is important, being able to measure the results, making sure those institutions collaborate. That's something we've learned. We didn't do it very well 20 years ago. We're doing it much better now. All of that is really important. Last thing I would say, we aren't going to have enough money to do everything we want. I think it's important to be both ambitious and be able to confront the truth. And in that world, we will have to get even sharper about making sure the most precious resources, grant funding, concessional resources, go to the countries and the sectors where there is no other option. And that we are open to saying in other areas, some of them may be adaptation, some of them may be, R&D, that this doesn't need to be that precious grant funding. We should think about that more in guarantees, in leveraging. So I think there are some basic tools out in the financial sector that we should be better at using in order to make resources even more effective than they are.
Great. Well, Ishak, I have one last question for you, but I think we're going to have a couple of minutes for audience Q&A. So if you have any questions, start thinking about them, and we'll have some mics around. But Ishak, maybe we can kind of start where we began. Oh. You developed with some colleagues something called the Bridge Proposal. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how IDA fits into that?
Sure. I mean, you notice Clémence always asks me questions about financial issues. It's very dry. But just to say a word.
I find it fascinating, and I think if our audience is here too, they might have a little love of dry financial issues.
But I mean, I'll approach your question by saying it'd be really important to preserve IDA's financing model, which turns grants into concessional loans, and so we get volume. And volume is really important. It's not the net that matters as much as the volume. I completely agree with both of you. And I say that from a practitioner point of view. I mean, I was with the World Bank in Ethiopia and in Ghana and Sierra Leone and Liberia, and I saw IDA at work. And I mean, frankly, the most happy moment of my life, maybe proud moment is working on watershed management with Mela Zenawi in Ethiopia, or on the rehabilitation of militias and the reintegration in society with Ellen Sirleaf, or I don't know, Feeders Road in Ghana, that really unleashed the power of marketing agriculture. Volume makes a difference. Working with, finding solutions, building institutions makes a difference, and that's volume. And so really preserving this model is very important. Now, this model is under threat because to the donors' money that you get in addition the return on old loans, the reflows, and borrowing from the market because of that balance sheet. And this model is under threat because increasingly IDA has to give grants rather than loans to countries that are deemed red, and there are 40 of them today, at risk, too much debt. And also going to the market with a weaker balance sheet, weakens the rating, the terms at which you can borrow. So, we need to think of solution. And it's not easy. Now, the bridge proposal that we put on the table comes from the realization that the debt crisis we're talking about is for many countries a crisis of liquidity rather than solvency. Let's not get into too much detail why that is, but I looked at IDA countries, and of the 40 red countries, we would classify 25 as liquidity constrained and 15 as more or less insolvent. And so IDA is and by the way, while the gross matters a whole lot, the net also matters, because when you're spending money locally, it generates imports demand, and it goes to foreign exchange. If there isn't enough foreign exchange because the dollars IDA put in reserves went to other creditors, then you have to devalue and you get macro instability. So that matters too. So how do we deal with this situation where we're in the middle of a situation where the dollars escape, either because countries are illiquid or insolvent? No easy question, but perhaps the next IDA could be a little bit more energetic at pushing other creditors to bear the burden. The illiquid countries, it's hard for IDA to scale up in particular cases because of its model, country allocation. So it has to rely more on the PRGF in those countries and on IBRD, and push them to be more dynamic and to put pressure on other creditors to bear the burden to pass these difficult moments until the market reopens. That's for the illiquid countries. How to do so is still a question mark, but it's much debated in policy circle, including the US administration is very involved in trying to get solutions. More coordination by other bilaterals. China's very important there, playing more coordinated together. And for the market, it's a bit harder, and there are 20 countries where the market is important. Now, for the other countries that are insolvent, here IDA itself could be a little bit more pushy, including now that the common framework works better, to go to the common framework and say, let's clean up, the balance sheet of the country because of an external shock very often, or because of bad policy, it became over-indebted. It's time to do the right reform, but also to remove the excess debt. And IDA could, instead of just giving grants and accepting whatever is happening, say, no, I want debt reduction, and I would actually bear the burden, even myself take the losses, but in a fair way. because IDA is so concessional that in a way it has provided ex ante that reduction. So a fairness rule will imply minimal losses for IDA, but accepting the burden would, for example, reduce Chinese opposition by saying, yes, we would take the loss as well. No easy solutions, but I think for the next IDA, really food for thought about how to be more active in resolving these situations.
Dirk, people are already talking about the next IDA, so it looks like you'll have to stick around past December.
Yes.
I'm going to take two questions from the audience, so raise your hand, and I think we're going to do this on a first-come, first-served basis. So I have one question here, and then one question at the back.
Thank you so much. Hi, I'm
Sorry, please wait for the microphone so our colleagues online can hear you.
Is this better? Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm Luisa Galveo. I'm WaterAid's new Senior Advocacy Advisor on IFIs. I had a question about the instruments that are used in lending for IDA. We've noticed an increase in lending going as budget support with policy conditionalities versus direct project lending. And I've heard debates about measuring the impact of that. So would just love to hear your thoughts on getting the balance right. Have there been conversations about this trend and increase in budget support lending as the instrument of choice? Would just love to learn what the conversations have been about that. Is the balance right, and how you're thinking about that? Thank you.
Great, and there's a question at the back as well. We'll cluster them.
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon. Yes. Good afternoon. My name is Rose Sterling. I'm from New York City. I just get off of my bus, so I rushed to her. I did not follow the preview part, but however, when I saw that the IDA bring the global safety net into focus, I was very excited. I couldn't wait. I just jumped onto the bus late and come see you. However, we shall know that without a sustainable safety net for all, the market, profit, all that are just, and no peace can be established in the world. Myself, I have been doing research on it. I do not have any PhD, but I have an empirical experience in Hungary, safety net, how it goes. So it's even good as I do not have my PhD yet. So I can be a real compliment to those who have PhD and we can really bring up things. 80%, 90% of those who lack safety net, everybody needs safety net, are just like me, no PhD. So, in fact, I have been doing research on a shift of a global public goods rooting in self-sustaining global public goods that take safety net, that we can even create a discipline throughout all universities in the world, focusing on the safety net. Because whether rich or poor, a kind of safety net is needed. And it depends, when you are, those who are very poor, safety net are just like, it's just like immediate needs that need to be fulfilled before they think even about going to school, going to that. So, and I wish that IDA, since it's a global project, will sustain me, give me public assistance, technical assistance, even a safety net to sustain me to work with different experts, bring up and show them the math route. I have already worked toward it. So okay, I'm ready.
Thank you so much. Those are some good words of encouragement to end on. Maybe Margaret and Dirk, I know we're at time. Maybe you can divide up the question very quickly on instruments. I feel like you're both going to have very strong views on this.
you understand? Yeah, it's always a live debate on how we use those. Like Ishak, I've worked in countries, in IDA countries and IBAD countries. I think if you look at the split and try to say what's the optimum, I don't think that's a useful conversation to have, because it really depends on country circumstances, and it depends on where you are on a timeline, right? So if you're right after a macroeconomic crisis or in the middle of a pandemic and you can't travel, then budget support is a fantastic solution, because you give those countries the liquidity that they need to be able to respond to the crisis. If you're in a more steady state situation, you want to use the DPF, the budget support, for those big structural reforms that the country needs, where you reward, if you like, very difficult policy actions that they need to take, and that often have negative fiscal consequences. You reward that with budget support. And then you have a steady state investment project portfolio where you do all of the investments that the country requires for education, for health, for roads, for electricity, etc. So it really depends on the country's circumstances. Both of them have their merits. I think we shouldn't swing too far in one or the other direction. And at the end of the day, the optimum is the aggregate of good choices in all 77 countries.
Yeah, it's great. You can have both more and less effective lending, either as project finance or as budget finance. And I think the real key is, what does the country need, and how are you measuring what you're asking them to do with the funds? And I think increasingly you see the institutions generally more responsive to starting from what the countries need and then working backwards. I think in that context, it's less concerning than it would have been, a decade ago, whether something is a project finance or a budget finance, because at the start, you're beginning with what the needs are, rather than a sort of top-down delivery of what you think needs to get done.
Great. Well, on that note, please join me in giving a big round of applause to our fantastic panelists. This was a really interesting conversation. And we will start our next panel in 5 minutes on IDA and results. So please stay. It's an IDA morning turning into an IDA afternoon.
Thanks, Simon.
Thank you so much.
Ready to go? Hey, everybody. Hi, thanks for coming back. I know it's kind of the lunch hour. I'm Karen Matheson. I'm a project director here at the Center for Global Development, but I've been working on IDA for almost 2 decades, on and off. And I really wanted to do this panel discussion today on results. I know it can be a little bit of a dry topic, but it really, really matters. And as somebody who used to have to fight for IDA, fight for funding, the results was the most important piece. And we were always asked, well, what exactly is IDA doing, and how can you prove it? And it's hard. It's hard often to show attribution, as we know. And then, of course, it's really important for impact, right? For the knowledge and learning agenda, I can't think of anything more important than having results and knowing what works and what doesn't. So the reason I want to talk about it today is there's going to be a shift for the first time in 20 years. And Ajay Banga was here last February, and he raised a lot of issues around process, and some of you heard the minister earlier today talk about, IDA is still, still can be cumbersome to deal with for a lot of reasons, and a lot of stipulations that the donors put in. And so he was very keen to see IDA simplified and streamlined enormously, and so here we are. We're going to see a real change. So I have 3 fabulous panelists representing the bank, a shareholder, and an external stakeholder and advocate. So let me just quickly introduce them, and then we will dive right in. Okay, so to my left, we have Julie Trepanier, and she is here from Canada. She's the IDA deputy. And then we have Kate Hudson, who is...
Donald. Kate Hudson is an actress,
I can't believe I just did that. I totally, listen, what can I say? You reminded me of her for some reason. Okay.
That's very flattering.
Welcome. And she is here. She's the head of the DC office for Oxfam International. And then Paloma Casero, who is here from the World Bank. You're Director of Strategy, Results, Risks, and Learning, right? You got that? That's quite a title, I must say. Okay, so let me dive into the questions, because I want to start with you. So as I understand it, IDA's typically had this 3 tiers where you have very high level impact and maybe not fully attributable to IDA, but things that are very important, like number of children who die before the age of 5, and then you would have a second tier indicator, which you could more attribute to IDA, which might be related issues like access to maternal health, to nutrition, to vaccine, and then the third tier indicator, which would be much more about how IDA itself is working, internal efficiency questions about their project management and oversight, and so on. But then, in addition to that, there are a lot of country targets, and I think some would say too many. And they covered the whole gamut, right? There's everything from climate, education, and health, and jobs, and gender, and so forth. And my understanding going forward is that there's going to be a change first to the tiered indicators, so they really align much more closely with the rest of the World Bank group. And then the country commitments are going to be slashed substantially. So I was wondering if you could just start by sharing some of the rationale behind the change, and how you think that might have an effect on IDA.
So thank you, Karen. It's great to be here and with great panelists as well. I'm going to start with. You made a comment that the IDA results could be dry, so I'm going to try to up that game a little bit, because if you think about how oftentimes the headline is about IDA being the largest concessional fund for the poorest countries, which of course is very important because we need obviously financing, and we are at a critical stage in the IDA replenishment for IDA 21. But this would not matter if we don't, those dollars do not transform people's lives in the poorest countries. So that's the focus on results. The results is, and that's one of the shifts that the new scorecard is trying to make, is really to shift the focus from dollars to lives transformed in the poorest countries that we support.
Yeah.
And the second point I want to make, and I'll elaborate a little bit on the rationale for the change, is that IDA is a repeat game, meaning that we are accountable. Once we have any policy commitments, any promise on what we are going to deliver, we need to be accountable. And for that, we need to be very transparent, and we need to be able to measure whatever commitments we have and in a consistent manner, in a rigorous manner. And that's the second point I wanted to speak to, which is the commitment to transparency and accountability, and upping that game as we go forward. And the third point I want to make is what you just were alluding to. The other shift is really on selectivity and simplification. When you try to prioritize everything, and one of the issues that we had as we were evolving was that we ended up with many indicators. We were measuring many things, not necessarily always with the same consistency, but many things. And what we need now, we live at a critical time. The world is evolving. The most vulnerable populations in IDA are at greatest need with all of the shocks. So we need focus. So part of the issue is selectivity for greater focus, and also to make sure we deploy all of us collectively, right? The World Bank Group, of course, but also to support IDA, but also the partners and other important stakeholders, civil society. And the only way where you galvanize and motivate people to act and drive action for impact is focus and selectivity. And that's the other part I wanted to make, is the shift from over 100 indicators to really these 22 indicators that speak to the critical development challenges that IDA countries face, and we can speak to that in more detail. So a couple of things I want to say and to excite the audience. One is, because I said I had to up the game. One is, please check out the website of the scorecard. It will give you an idea. Is if you do WBG scorecard, just click on it. You're going to have fun. It's an interactive website. And this is important. It's interactive and highly customized. And that, again, goes to the aspect of being able to aggregate, but also disaggregate. And today, you can still see the results for IDA direct results that we have at the moment. It will allow you to see not just how we do in all IDA countries, but within countries. We are also committed to transparency and reproducibility of these results. So how you are going to see that? When you click on those results, you are going to see not just the data, but you are going to see the methodologies to ensure that we know that we are measuring consistently these results. You're also going to see the metadata. This is for the first time. We do that. That allows anybody to reproduce the results. And if there are questions, of course, we welcome the feedback, but that's, I think, important. For the first time, ahead of an IDA cycle, we'll have that. And then a final point I want to make is the fact that all of this is co-created. Of course, we had a lot of interactions with many of you in the audience and in the panel. We have a good discussions as well. And it matters because at the end, IDA, the stakes are very high and we need everybody.
Thank you. So Julie, as a shareholder and a big and important one who I know is planning very significant contribution in the coming months, can you talk about how important the results commitments are for you from the perspective of caring about development finance, but also in terms of engaging with your parliament and other stakeholders to build a case for IDA? And then, any thoughts you have on the shift would be really helpful too.
Well, thanks for inviting me, but
thanks for raising expectations on our side.
You're so welcome.
I mean, Canada is a strong supporter of IDA, and regardless of the level of contribution, which is out of my hands, it will continue to be. And the reason, it is the single largest line in our ODA budget. And the reason is because it's aligned with our international assistance priorities. It's support, like it is a robust country engagement model. It's efficient, but also get results. And so results are very important. When we engage with our parliament, it's not so much on the number of policy commitments, on like it's at more higher level. But these matters, and this IDA replenishment comes at a time of change, and the sequencing of all these changes, it's probably not ideal, but it's also not a reason not to support the evolution agenda and make changes. But one thing we've been clear since the beginning, and we're not the only one, the only shareholders, is that all the change in terms of simplification and evolution is to make it easier on countries, like on borrowing countries. It's not to make our life easier. I always make the comparison that if my minister asks me to do something and I say it's going to make my life difficult, I don't really care. Like if the outcome is good. So I think that's through this lens that we look at this. As Paloma is obviously the expert and explain it better, but like the results framework has different components, and many of these are changing. I think overall, what we feel is that we need to be able to tell a very compelling and clear story about how they fit. And to be perfectly honest, I think we're making progress, but we're not quite there yet. And that's a collective effort. I think shareholders and the bank and the CSO community. And I want to give a shout out to those, including our own Results Canada. I know they're here because they've been very actively engaged in this and providing us feedback. Like this is my first IDA replenishment, so I've been learning a lot about this. I was at the World Bank board before, but not following IDA. So, this is actually quite important, and we're not there yet. I think we're supportive of the way forward, the new scorecard, the IDA specific vision, because we've been supportive of having a World Bank group approach for a long time, and I think it makes sense. Having like all these different pieces that are hard to piece together was hard. We also like the level of sophistication in terms of disaggregation. Sorry, I'm losing my voice that we'll get, and the access to the metadata. I think that this is a very huge improvement, and I think you probably want to play that one like even like a bit louder than you have been. I mean, the devil's in the details, and I think because these pieces are being like put forward right now and developed, like we don't have all the pieces that are, at ends. And so that's the thing I think we need to be careful as we finish the replenishment to make sure that we, as IDA, like as shareholders at IDA Deputy, we need to see all these pieces and be able to provide a current commitment, coupling stories. On the policy commitments, I would say this has been a difficult discussion, right? Because being against like efficiency, like it's like being against virtue. So like you can't be saying, no, I really want to keep this like very complicated framework.
Right.
But the framework was also like built because to respond to country needs, to shareholders needs. So in looking at this, and I think this is going to be an evolution, not too different than the World Bank evolution. Is 22 the right number? I don't know. Like I think we're trying to cover like the landscape. But one thing that is clear is that for us, the reduced number of commitments should not be, and I trust the bank when they say this, like a reduced ambition. And this is where I think we're still working on the story. I'll be very honest. Like I think there's a huge communication effort there, but also some like technical work that needs to be done. And we'll discuss like in more details about like some example on gender, for example. So overall, I think I feel I'm almost there if I was to be able to sell IDA 21 because I can rely on the progress and all the good things that the previous IDA replenishment have done. But I think we're still missing that like very like simple like the elevator pitch that you need to provide. That's the piece missing right now. But I'm also confident that we'll get there.
Yeah, I think it's always been hard, the elevator pitch when you have like shots in arms for Gavi and so forth. But Kate, so you're look, Oxfam is just tremendously important in the advocacy community. You follow IDA really closely. I'm just curious, have you advocated for anything in particular as part of this replenishment? And are you seeing that reflected in any way? And how might the switch in the much leaner results approach affect your ability to advocate for IDA?
Yeah, thanks, Karen, and thanks to CGD for having us here. So I want to start with a really important disclaimer, is that although some of what I'm going to say is quite critical of the policy package and the proposed IDA results framework, Oxfam is, as Karen says, a very, very staunch supporter and advocate of the need for donor governments to step up and secure an unprecedented IDA replenishment for all the reasons that earlier speakers have discussed today. You know, indeed, we think that stepping up their IDA pledge is just one among many ways that donor governments, rich country governments, should be taking to finance sustainable development, you know, including fulfilling their climate finance commitments, contributing to the new loss and damage fund, etc. So now's where I take a breath and say the but. So none of this should be taken as a kind of get out of jail free card for the donors, okay? So I also want to, actually, before I transition to the but, I do really want to applaud the efforts that Paloma and the bank have made on the new corporate scorecard, because I do think it was a very thoughtful process, and I think the new portal that Paloma was getting us all excited about is a really good example of the kind of more radical transparency, as the bank has been saying, that we would like to see them adopt across the board, including, for example, on climate finance, where we've discovered some quite big gaps and inconsistencies in what the bank claims versus what's actually reported and spent. So that is all very good. But here's the but. You see, I trailed it before, but really here it is. So we are a bit concerned about how the necessarily broad headline commitments in the corporate scorecard have translated to the draft IDA policy package and results framework. And in particular, we think there seems to be a bit of a mismatch in terms of specificity and ambition and the follow-through that we would have expected to see in IDA. So, for example, the new corporate scorecard introduced a new vision indicator on inequality, which we think is a really important recognition by the bank that reducing inequality is going to be really key to achieving all its other goals. And this indicator measures the number of countries with what the bank defines as high inequality. And actually, the majority of these countries that are in this category right now are also IDA countries. So one might think that the IDA policy package would then take seriously the need to include commitments and measures that incentivize and track the reduction of inequality. But we're not really seeing that to the extent that we would like. Instead, we see like a lot of the broad goals being quite equity blind. For example, we've asked the bank, will they try and disaggregate and report results by income level? This is really crucial because how else are we meant to know if broad targets, for example, on millions of people accessing health services or accessing education are actually benefiting the poorest and hardest to reach rather than the middle class or the upper middle class? And how can IDA countries move out of this high inequality bracket if they're not being supported and incentivized to design and deliver policies that are sure to redistribute opportunities and income and power? And in this vein, we've also seen the policy commitment on domestic resource mobilization watered down from IDA 20. So references to progressive revenue policies have been removed. So this is just one example. And just referencing, I know that we're going to talk more about it now, I think gender is another area where we're really disappointed and concerned. Because the stark fact is that there are no country-level policy commitments on gender in the draft policy package. And no matter how you spin it, I do think this is a retrogression from IDA 20, and it sends a really dangerous signal. And now the bank is saying, and I'm wrapping up here, I promise, the bank is saying that we don't need to be worried about the lack of country-specific gender commitments because the new institutional gender strategy will be kind of the proxy for these policy commitments. But to me, that's like comparing apples and oranges. Like the World Bank gender strategy, no matter how good you think it is, and I see there's some representatives from the World Bank gender team in the room here, like what incentive do governments have to implement the World Bank gender strategy, and what legitimacy does it have at the national level? And most importantly, how can CSOs, including women's groups, hold their governments and the World Bank accountable to it? So in conclusion, and I'll pass it back to you, Karen, I think we do question, Julie, you said you trust the bank on the ambition front, and I'm glad to hear it, but I think we definitely have questions as to really this IDA, with what we're currently seeing, can genuinely be called the most ambitious ever.
I'm going to give you a chance to respond in a second, but I did want to get a little bit more granular on the gender piece in particular, for a couple of reasons. One is, when you have this issue of selectivity, there are times when you really want to advance certain priorities, where governments in particular might be a little reluctant, or where they're new, and biodiversity, climate, gender, these are all relatively new compared to some of the more traditional indicators. And they really do enable you, when you have those commitments, to follow through over different IDAs and see what happens. And so that's sort of what I'm wondering about is there a risk of losing on the demand side for some of the gender-related goals, and then on the knowledge side. And one example would be the childcare that was introduced in IDA 2021, and there was an enormous amount of effort around trying to encourage and support IDA to be able to do more on childcare, very much in the wake of COVID, because there was such a realization of the extent to which childcare and other unpaid labor really disadvantaged women, and that really brought that to the fore. So I think that's why, and then also, again, in terms of selectivity, it's not as if you're eliminating the country commitments. There will still be some for jobs and fragility and climate, but just not for gender. So for those of us who have been sort of fighting this battle for a couple of decades, I think we do wonder a little bit about the rationale behind that as well. So you are now on the hot seat. Take it away.
Well, first of all, I wanted to thank you all, because I think this is the kind of conversations we need to have, right? I think we are all here co-creating. We all have the same objective, which is really to get to an ambitious IDA that really making tangible impacts on vulnerable people. So we all share the same objective, and I really appreciate this conversation. So let me just go to 3 points, one of each. So one is, so Julie, you're right in the sense that this is still obviously, and we are still working with you. We are going to have more days ahead of us to show you where we are, both on the policy commitment package, the replenishment package, and then you were asking, well, I need to see a bit more on which you will have the methodology notes coming soon, and I think part of it is I do understand there is a timing issue. But compared to the previous IDA cycles, this is the first time that IDA deputies will have the methodology notes for all of the policy commitments right at this point. So I think that's at least we can still have the conversation, but you'll have that baseline, expected, etc. Second, you'll also have for the first time the methodologies, and as we said, and at least a way to measure results in a way that is consistent, that we couldn't really claim before because we didn't have these methodologies, and now we do. When it comes to but I agree with you on the elevator pitch, and it is, we need to keep working at that, and we'll get there, because I do feel that there is, we do are, and I will go back to that point on gaining momentum, and we are gaining momentum, and we'll explain a bit more. Let me just pick up, Kate, on a couple of issues. So, for example, let me pick up on inequality, which, and you're right, and we thank you, and so many of you in the audience that really help us really continue to focus on inequality, and the vision indicator does reflect that. How this translates, you were saying it will be great to have the distributional impacts of everything we do. Now, and we don't disagree with that. Now, the issue is data quality and timeliness and coverage to be able to do what you say, which is actually where we would like to go. So the first thing we looked is as household level surveys. Those are national statistics that really help us then understand the distributional impacts on anything that we do in country. And for that, in the IDA 21, we do have a commitment to invest in updating and upgrading the household surveys. There, in 50% of the IDA countries today, the household surveys are older than 5 years. Now, the scorecard is ambitious in trying to have enough coverage of countries to be able to measure So for example, to have that metric, it would require enough coverage, enough frequency of the data reporting, because we commit to annual reporting. So if the lag is 5 years, we just cannot do it. So it doesn't mean that we don't share the concern. It's just we need to help also other countries with capacity and other efforts to build the data infrastructure to allow us to do better. But great point. And then meanwhile, in the multidimensional aspects of inequality, you were saying, how are we going to track if there are widening gaps? So once you go beyond just the income level, you will go into inequality of in access, in the quality of the services, in the affordability of the services provided, and all of these aspects are across the indicators or in the scorecard that we are going to be tracking with all sorts of indicators. So that's just to at least we will get into gaps that would, and that's one point I want to make, is how are we going to use this data? Because we used to have the scorecard, or in the past the RMS, as a reporting tool. Now we are committing to use it as an accountability tool, which means as a managerial tool, which means that now, because we can disaggregate for the first time, it goes back to what is new. For the first time, we can disaggregate the data. We can then say, okay, this is what the progress we are achieving, but where are the shortcomings? Where are we not doing enough? Maybe in this country has high level of learning poverty, and maybe to very disadvantaged groups, and yet we are not present. And before we couldn't really tell that across the results. So that's another aspect I wanted to make. And then finally on the gender, I think the other part that we need to think, I think is an issue that we all care again. We all care about gender equality. It's a very important, we share the same goal, of course, and in other countries is critical. And what I wanted to say just very briefly is the ambition is now, with the new gender strategy and the fact that we have an institutional commitment in IDA 21, is to implement it in all countries. And let me explain what that means in practice, and the accountability, and how we are going to track. First of all, we are asking that all of the CPFs have gender equality objectives that, of course, are customized to the key priorities of advancing gender equality. So in one country could be gender-based violence, the number top issue. Another country could be labor market gaps, especially for women and adolescents. So this is a very important aspect that I wanted to mention, is that we are going to be tracking. Now we have a CPF reform, and again, we have a time issue to explain everything we want to do.
Maybe if you could just spell out CPF.
So country partnership frameworks, thank you, Karen. And this is basically, that's the tool we use. This is, we work with, of course, at the intersection of these priorities that we are discussing and the country demand. And it's very important. This strategy is really is the foundation of the country programming for us, and to be able to deliver results. For the first time, these country partnership frameworks now are also going to be focused on very few outcome objectives that are going to be linked to the scorecard. And for the gender strategy, the commitment is for all other countries. The CPS will need to have that commitment to have gender equality objectives. We are also going then to have results and measure these results, which we didn't do before, which means that as we go, I used to be a country director, so just let me put it concretely. I used to be a country director and for the World Bank, and if I were now to be country director with this new emphasis of accountability and managing for results, I would be very carefully looking, not just at what the CPF objectives are and results, and in some cases targets. So that's another thing on ambition. Tomorrow, Ajay will be announcing two targets related to gender and the gender strategy, and that matters. These are results to be achieved by 2030. They are not just ambition, they're really ambition to deliver them. If I'm a country director in an IDA country, I would be looking carefully at the actions that are going to make a needle change, to move the needle towards these results. And we are having annual check-ins, which is another innovation. CPFs used to be documents that the state, once agreed, the state. Now, and this is really, and Ajay will speak to that more, but the kind of like the change, the reform is towards annual, kind of like business plans. And this is going to accompany the implementation plan of the gender strategy. That again is going to be discussed. Thank you. I see a 15 minutes remaining.
Thank you. No,
So anyways,
That's
all
really
of this to say that, we think that the momentum is there. But
Okay.
of course, we're on a journey.
So Julie, again, sticking with gender, since Canada's always been such a huge proponent of gender equality, and you had your feminist foreign policy and so forth, I'm just interested in how you see IDA and gender, and if you're comfortable with this approach as it's been laid out.
Yeah, no, as you mentioned, we have our our feminist international assistance policy. So gender equality is a top priority in IDA. And going back to my first point about like why we are so much support of IDA, it's because it's aligned with our priorities. So it has to continue to be aligned with our priorities.
Yeah.
I would say, and I want to go back to a point I made and Kate picked up on about like I trust the bank. I do, but the work is not over yet. I'll be honest. And it's because, there's so many things happening. Like every time I listen to Paloma, I learn something new, something that I like, but it's just to show that we're in this like very like transitional cycle and it's hard. And so I'll say, yes, I think we've been pushing this since day one on IDA 21. I mean, the fact that now we have a commitment that, the gender strategy will apply to all IDA countries is because of us and a number of other shareholders. This is positive. I think we need to see, okay, how it's going to be implemented, what are going to be the targets, and I'm looking forward to see the targets announced tomorrow, but also like how resources will be allocated. So I think this is where, that's what I'm saying, where the work is ongoing and it's live, and so we need to see this and demonstrate it in a way that everyone can understand and say, yeah, that's not a step back. Because if it was considered a step back, that would become a huge issue for us and not only Canada, like a number of other shareholders, like IDA has been doing tremendous work on gender equality, and it has to continue.
So. So Kate, just to conclude on this vein, and then we'll open it up for a few minutes. Like, what would you most like to see between now and December in terms of particularly this area, make you sense confident that it's more robust?
So I think, like, I agree that this conversation is like really helpful and important, and I'm also learning new things, and it's comforting to hear that actually IDA deputies are also learning new things. So it's not just me. So, I think what we really want to see is we want a kind of more clarity and ambition. And I think those two things are related. So to come back to the point about, Paloma, it's really good what you were saying about, the CPFs and, that they're all going to include gender and the World Bank gender strategy. That's great to hear, but to me, it's not an either or. I think we should have both. We should be having gender in all the CPFs, but we should also have concrete targets on gender in IDA, because I do worry that why do we care about results and why do we care about targets? We care about them because they send a signal, they incentivize action, and they facilitate accountability. And so I really, really worry about the impacts on the signal it sends and the impacts on accountability and action if those gender commitments aren't up there in the headline in IDA 21. So that we really, really want to see improvement on that front, and we'd really like to see some specific targets on gender in the policy package. I would also say, kind of in terms of clarity, like it is very confusing. We went into this whole simplified process, but I would really question, and I do understand the rationale behind the intention to simplify IDA. I think it was a good impulse. However, I would question whether what we've ended up with is actually simpler. Like we don't have the tiers anymore, but we kind of do. They're just called something different. And then we have this issue of kind of like consistency between the different not tiers, building blocks, or whatever we're calling them now. So for example, like on health, one of the things we're looking at, like in the people bento box, I won't go too into the weeds here, don't worry. We have, there's in the kind of approach section, there's an emphasis on equity, which we're really happy to hear, and it talks about the need for universal health coverage, UHC. But then when you go into the other building blocks, I mean, the outcomes don't talk about UHC, they just talk about like quality health services, and that could be achieved through a number of different means, some of which probably aren't very equitable. And then in the policy commitment section, there's something about de-risking health investments through MEGA and IFC, which we're really concerned about because we've seen lots of very negative impacts when you bring kind of de-risking approaches and private finance approaches into healthcare. So we really want to see that like clarity and consistency, and we want to see that high level ambition, especially on gender. Having said all that, I will again go back to my disclaimer that, like, do we still think IDA is a really important tool for financing sustainable development? Yes, absolutely. We just think it could have more impact with these changes.
Fantastic. Those were really great, helpful, granular answers. So I want to open it up for some questions. I'm pretty sure we have one from CGD. If I can go ahead and bug Mary, and then Dan, absolutely. Okay.
Dan's one over there.
Oh, great. Okay. We're going to go 1, 2, 3.
Thank you so much, everyone. For those of you who don't know, I'm a policy fellow here on the Gender Equality and Inclusion team. So much, particularly what Kate said and Karen said, really resonates. What we've been pushing for is really thinking about, accountability, and we don't see it as an either or, right? It's about supporting the implementation of the gender strategy with specific things. And my understanding is the targets were announced yesterday, but they are, in case they weren't, I won't say what they are, but they are very narrow, I would say, in terms of the issues that we see being really, really important on gender in IDA countries. And so, I'm kind of confused about why there is this resistance to the country-based policy commitments, because it seems, again, complementary. And so if you could really speak to that and help clarify that, it would help, because they were there before, right? We did have a GBV and childcare commitment, and then they were cut. And, I don't see that can't be, again, complementary. Those are really important areas that we want to see progress on and hold the bank to account. We do trust them, but my second point in question is, someone talked about the devil being in the details, and this is something we've been really picking up on. In the scorecard data that was released in June, there was kind of a disclaimer at the end about female disaggregation. And it said that there would be kind of proxies used, right? So where you don't have results data, that you're going to just use the female percentage of the population to proxy the results. This is really scary, because ultimately you're saying, we should trust this data. We should trust the corporate scorecard as being reflective of impacts for gender. But that, obviously raises concerns about whether or not we can trust that. So if you could let us know, where that is as you're evolving with these methodologies, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Let me get the other 2 questions, and then we'll let the panelists finish up. Dan?
Great. Thanks, Karen, and thanks to the panelists. Dan Peters with the Gates Foundation. Paloma, my question specifically for you, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit. So I think we've talked very loosely about targets within the indicators. And when I look at the scorecard, those don't really look like targets. They're framed as expected results, which I assume is just collating expected results out of projects. So it's not really an ex-ante target. But as you pointed out, tomorrow you're going to have President Bonga announce 2 corporate commitments. Obviously, you already did that at the spring meetings with the health coverage, the 1.5 billion, with the 300 million people who will be hooked up to electricity in Africa. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what the process is between selecting actual ex-ante targets in some of these areas versus the indicators that just have expected results. Because it is a little bit more difficult to track how the bank is performing with the expected results. There's not really a hard time frame. And so it'd be great if you could talk a little bit just about what the internal process looks like on that. Thanks.
All right, last question here.
Jean-François Tardy from Results Canada. Thanks for organizing this, CGD. It's really a very, very useful panel. I'll start with kudos to the bank and to Paloma's team for their scorecard, which is really an incredible playground. If you're a data geek, this is really fabulous, okay? And frankly, something that should be copied by other institutions, whether bilateral or multilateral. So it's setting a new level. I also want to thank those at the bank and those in the IDA deputy course, especially led by Canada, who managed to put a little bit more specificity into gender commitments. Now we see something specific about gender-based violence. We see something specific about maternal and reproductive health. So that's the way we want to go with something specific. But I really want to echo what Dan was saying, which is we're lacking ex-ante targets. So that means, it may sound really technical, but it's frankly, it just speaks to what are we getting for $100 billion? Right now, what we say is we're going to get the most incredible scorecard that will allow us to monitor as we go what we are getting. But we're not saying before what that money is going to be for. I mean, normally you go to the restaurant, you order, you're supposed to be your 16-ounce sirloin steak or whatever it is. You know what you're getting and what quantity.
Yeah.
And now you know. So I think that's really what's missing, and I think it's really important because let me tell you what could be the top-line messaging. I don't know about the targets by tomorrow, but perhaps if we had for $105 billion, IDA will deliver health services to 700 million people in IDA countries. It will offer safety net protection to 350, 400 million people in IDA countries. We know what we'd be getting. Of course, we want to have more specificity, as my friend from Oxfam was saying. What does it include exactly? But we would have a ballpark. So I really think it's important that we have this conversation and find out why the reluctance to actually not provide 65 of those numerical targets, but 3, 4. Perhaps that would be simplifying IDA. If we could say that's what you get for IDA, the top line, and a few other things also as bonus. Finally, just a quick question. I love the scorecard, as I said at the beginning, but when you have very few policy commitments, and the one policy commitment in human capital says we're going to really focus on services to early years. Well, what happens in early years? The number one challenge is that it's the bracket with the highest mortality rate. Why? 50% of those deaths are caused by malnutrition. Perhaps just should we be able to find out whether malnutrition, wasting specifically, stunting specifically is being addressed through IDA? We need just to be able to measure this. We're making progress or not making progress. It's very simple. So this is not just like the general scorecard, but that is true specifically in IDA countries for that specific commitment. So we need that support. Thank you very much.
All right. The floor is yours.
I love this, just so that you know, you didn't feel the excitement. So thank you, because again, as I said, we need these conversations. So the stakes are too high. So let me just go 3 points, because otherwise I will get this card saying 5 minutes left.
Right.
So first one, on the why, let me go to CDG. I think there was, you raised 2 very important points. So one is on why we are trying to reduce these country level commitments that were there before. So yes, but we also heard from client countries that at the end, if you look at IDA 20, we've had over 1,000 country policy commitments. So it really became a burden, and this was communicated to us over and over again. So yes, we needed country policy commitments. What we try to do, and the commitment to simplify that, is not just on policy commitments. You will see it also in the financing architecture, because the whole idea is to, and that's why you see some simplification around the windows, and the theme of that is trying to think that at the end of the day, IDA results will not be delivered if the clients that are actually implementing these projects and have capacity issues do not see more focus and more selectivity. So it's a balance. It's never about either or. So we do need a critical set of country policy commitments. We just have to have the balance with the country demand and hearing both, getting into a balance of, we are reducing, but we are not eliminating. We are going from over 1,000 to 500 country actions, but then we do have institutional actions that apply to all IDA countries. So it isn't like we are eliminating, I want to say, commitment to GBV or childcare. And we're happy to talk a bit more offline, but we do have it, because the moment that we are committing to implement the gender strategy in all countries, childcare is right there. You have the GBV. We have indicators, sub-indicators that will track progress to that on results and not just on actions or inputs. So let's talk a bit more on that. Second, on your female disaggregation, let me tell you the realities. Again, goes back to the data that we have at source. The source of the data comes from from national statistics and from country level data. So what we have right now is 45% of the portfolio that is capturing the results do have and report sex disaggregated data. So it's a mix. It's not like all of them are model-based. So we do have projects that are actually collecting the data. Are we collecting in all? No, because we have issues also at the source. So and that's part of the investments in NIDA 21 is precisely to level the game up and getting more female disaggregated data that we all want, to be honest. Everybody wants, even the policymakers, of course, from gender safety to gender-based violence and so on. So the commitment is there. We'll get better over time, and we will continue reporting over time. And we welcome any suggestions that also you may have. On Gates Foundation, you had a very good comments on targets. Sorry, I was just locating you. Thank you. So, so two things. The scorecard expected results is, you are absolutely correct. What they are trying to tell you is the ambition of the current portfolio. It doesn't tell you the future delta or a stretch. It's telling you the ambition of the current portfolio because it's aggregation of end of the project targets. Now, and that's how the scorecard had the stock of results achieved for the current portfolio and these expected results. In the world now of announcing targets, we do need to track progress to target. And this is actually a conversation we will love to have. We have right now a column in the scorecard that will have more data as we go now, because we need to make sure we track all of the corporate targets. But we will be measuring progress to targets. Basically, we will have a cumulative progress of results from the baseline of that target all the way to 2030. So that will be in the scorecard. So you'll be able to see both the stock and the flow, which is important. And you will be able to see for which indicators we have announced targets and how to track progress. And then, Results Canada, thank you so much. So great to see the excitement on the scorecard, so we can talk more. There is also a virtual reality experience. If you want to have an immersive experience, I really welcome you. I told you that I wanted to get you excited. It's in the atrium. You can go anytime and use it. It's great. Now, let's go to the challenging questions, which are very important. So you are right about the ex-ante, basically what we used to have, where even though they were loosely called targets, to be honest, there were ex-ante ranges of values of a certain number of indicators, right? That's what you mean, with a baseline. So we are describing this in the methodology notes that are going to come also for the benefit of Julia, many of you. There will be methodology notes for each of the policy commitments as well. And of course, you'll have that. Now, for the targets that have been already announced, for which IDA is a key contributor, if just think M300, really, it's IDA it's IDA that has to come very strongly in support. Or if you think about the universal health target, social safety nets, the ones that are going to be announced tomorrow on gender, we already have targets. And so what we need to do then is the contribution to target by IDA, and because the scorecard is disaggregating, and this is targets on results achieved by 2030. I want to emphasize this. The ambition is bigger than before. It's not expected results.
Okay.
Our commitment is to achieve those results by 2030. And as you know, some of these targets, when you think about the types of projects that deliver these results, they have different maturity curves. Mm-hmm. You may see, so it's not the same as an electricity project actually delivering new connections and households connected versus a cash transfer program that can be immediately, delivering the dollars to the household. So we will. That's why the commitment is actually strong. The stretch is stronger because it's really results achieved by 2030, and we will do that by IDA, and you will be able to see that baseline and your contribution and annual progress. And I'm mindful of time, but I think you had other questions. Let me see if I can quickly call.
I think we have to wrap it up.
Okay, to be continued, but lovely conversation.
Thank you so much for staying. Please, round of applause for these fabulous. Thank you guys so much. That was terrific.
Thank you.
Really appreciate you.